There is something fishy about this next story, and it is all about fish and the other seafood you eat. A new report says a lot of it is mislabeled, and it's happening across the country. Julia Levin is a seafood fraud campaigner for Oceana Canada, the group that issued this report. She joins us from Ottawa. Julia, your group tested seafood samples from 5 cities across Canada. What did you find?
Exactly. We've tested cities from 5 cities across the country, and we found that nearly 44% of the nearly 400 samples we tested were mislabeled, which is a very alarming amount.
And mislabeled how?
Mislabeling can take different forms. What we focused on was species substitution, which is when one species, one type of fish, is labeled as an entirely different species. For example, selling tilapia labeled as snapper.
Okay, and we're looking at a list of these common substitutions. I'm just looking at halibut is very expensive, wild-caught salmon, more expensive than farmed Atlantic salmon. What was the fish substituted for, and are we being ripped off?
There are certainly economic implications to seafood fraud. In 74% of the instances of mislabeled fish, we found that the fish on the label or menu was a more expensive variety than what was actually being sold. So there are clear economic implications of seafood fraud on consumers and the industry as a whole, because responsible seafood businesses are also facing unfair market competition through seafood fraud.
Would it just be economics as the reason to replacing fish and labeling it differently?
There are other implications as well. There are important significant health impacts as a result of seafood fraud. If you're eating a fish that has the wrong label, you might be exposing yourself to a fish you're allergic to, or a fish with high levels of contaminants such as mercury. In fact, in nearly 60% of the mislabeled instances, there were health-related implications for consumers. One example is one of the more common substitutes we found was escalar, which has also been called the laxative of the sea for its impact on the gastrointestinal system. And of course, there's also ocean consequences as a result of seafood fraud. Seafood fraud disguises endangered fish. 30% of the mislabeled species were actually threatened, endangered, or vulnerable species. So this has a large impact on the conservation of our ocean's abundance.
And you found seafood fraud at grocery stores and in restaurants in 5 cities across Canada. How could something like this happen?
What's important to understand is how complex seafood supply chains are. A seafood product might be fished in Canada, sent to China to be processed, a third country to be breaded, and then finally make its way back to Canada. That's a long, complex supply chain, and right now in Canada, we don't have traceability requirements. What that means is there's no requirement for once the fish is taken from the water for information to travel with it as it moves throughout the supply chain, and that's what allows seafood fraud to happen. That's why what we're calling on the government to do, and specifically the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, is to implement something that's called full chain boat-to-plate traceability to ensure that all seafood sold in Canada is safe, legally caught, and honestly labeled.
Yes, your organization, Oceana Canada, is lobbying the government for this. How successful have you been?
We launched this campaign a year ago and have been in talks with the government over that time. CFIA has acknowledged that seafood fraud is a significant issue in Canada. Unfortunately, they had the opportunity this summer, under the Safe Food for Canadian regulations, to implement traceability requirements which would address seafood fraud, but they fell short. The regulations, as released, do not address seafood fraud. They do not prevent the entry of illegally caught food into Canadian supply chains, and they leave Canada well behind international best practices.
I assume that restaurants and grocery stores wouldn't know that they're participating in this kind of fraud. As a consumer, what can I do then to make sure that I'm eating what I think I'm eating?
There's a few things consumers can do. One of the most important things consumers can do is help us lobby CFIA for real long-term change that applies to the whole industry. We've seen traceability requirements in Europe, in the European Union, and they work. Seafood fraud rates have fallen significantly after the regulations that we're lobbying for were put into place. But in the short term, consumers can ask questions of the seafood they're purchasing. They should ask what species it is, where it was caught, and how it was caught. They can also look for voluntary traceability mechanisms such as the Marine Stewardship Council, for example.
Okay, Julia, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
That's Julia Levin. She's a seafood fraud campaigner with Oceana Canada, joining us from Ottawa.